maybe I'm being duped. God knows there's a part of me that hopes that this entire thing is a hoax. This idea that I'm engaged in this as part of some kind of either incredibly naive sort of useful idiocy, or that I'm secretly on board with a terroristic effort to wipe out a people, strikes me as the sort of argument that is so lazy in its conception that I feel somewhat offended that I have to take it in good faith.
The images, sounds, and stories of abduction, torture, terror, indiscriminate violence, and mass murder coming from Israel, Gaza, and the Occupied Palestinian Territories since October 7, 2023, have been shattering. The sight of the wounded and deeply traumatized, the broken, dismembered, and burnt bodies of the very young and the very old, homes, academic, religious, and cultural institutions, memories and dreams razed to the ground. The unrelenting, inhumane assaults. Throughout it all, some have sought to ignore, to dismiss, and to gaslight. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Omar El Akkad is a Canadian writer and journalist who has neither ducked nor run for cover. He hasn't averted his eyes or closed his ears or his heart to the suffering unfolding on our TV screens, tablets, and smartphones in real time. Omar El Akkad was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1982. He grew up in Qatar, settled in Canada as a teenager, and graduated from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He now lives in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. His books include the award-winning novels American War and What Strange Paradise. Both were finalists in CBC's Canada Reads and winners of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award and the Oregon Book Award for Fiction. His latest book is called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, and it addresses what has been transpiring in Israel, Gaza, and the Occupied Palestinian Territories since 2023 and long before. He joins me now. Hi, Omar.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Omar, we last spoke in November 2021 during COVID. I think we spoke after what was at the time a triumph for you. Just weeks earlier, you had won the Giller Prize, Canada's most prestigious literary award for What Strange Paradise. And I think it's safe to say that the prize in many ways changed your life. What's changed for you since 2021?
Wow. I'm trying to think of where to start with that question. I was back home out here in Oregon. I was working on what I hoped would be my next novel. I was doing the thing I've done for most of my life, which is kind of disappearing into the world of a made-up story. And then I stopped doing all of that. And instead I started writing what ended up being my first book of nonfiction. I don't know that a lot of life has changed in terms of, the day-to-day workings of how I live. But I think who I am as a person has changed quite a bit. A lot of the things that I used to really, really care about and used to mean a great deal to me, particularly as it relates to sort of my career aspirations or how I want to be perceived or, that sort of thing, have sort of gone out the window. So I don't know if I'm a different person in terms of my day-to-day mechanics, but certainly in terms of my priorities or what I feel I want to do with whatever limited time I have certainly changed quite a bit.
Your new book, your first book of nonfiction, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, is a book about betrayal, about hypocrisy, a book about loss, a book about the severing of ties, a book about the ending of a relationship, a book about the end of a dream, a book about genocide. How did this book project begin? How would you describe its origin story?
In very early November of 2023, my editor was in Portland for the book festival, and we were out to dinner, and I was raving and ranting about not knowing what my place is in this part of the world anymore. And my suspicion is that he just got so sick of listening to me that at a certain point he said, you should be writing about this. And I had been sort of sketching out ideas because that's what I do. But with his guidance, I started doing that in a much more focused way. And what ended up happening is that you get this very strange triptych of a book in the sense that you have one thread that is very much a personal story of the kind of upbringing I've had and this orientation towards the West and towards the principles of the West, or what I believe those principles to be. And then you have this kind of journalistic story of the things I saw during my 10 years as a journalist. And then you have the story about the last year and a half and what it means to wake up every day and see evidence of the worst things human beings can do to one another and know that you're responsible for it. Your tax dollars are paying for it. You know, all of the things you've described this book as, I can't argue against. They're exactly about those things. But to me, the one I would add, and the one that becomes the defining aftertaste of this book for me, is a deep sense of uncertainty.
Uncertainty, and you also note it's also about grief. You know, later in the book, you write, there's a numb, overriding grief that colors life in the audience to a slaughter. And like all measures of grief, it is born not of some exotic incendiary impulse, but of the most plain, unadorned knowing. What is that knowing?
In a kind of concrete sense, there's things I'm never going to unsee. It's the number of images of slaughtered children I've seen over the last year and a half. You know, I suspect everybody has moments in their lives where they say, I was one person on one side of this and I'm another person on the other side. And for me, in the last year and a half, it was the audio of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl begging for her life shortly before Israeli soldiers fired somewhere in the range of 355 bullets into her car, killing her and her family members, and then the medics who had come to try and save her. I was one person before I experienced that, and I'm another person after. In a more abstract sense, I suppose that one of the ways that I think anyone makes peace with the failings of their society, of the society they live in, and every society has failings, is to be able to compartmentalize them, to be able to say this was a one-off bad thing, or this was a bad thing, and then people learned better and knew better, and I'm not able to do that anymore.
You, of course, like the rest of the world, were alerted to the horror that was October 7th, 2023, a day that you say changed everything for you. We know that armed groups led by Hamas military wing attacked a number of cities near Israeli-occupied the Gaza Strip. We know that 1,200 people are killed, over 800 of whom are civilians, 282 women, 39 children, 250 people are abducted. You describe it in the book as a bloodbath. First of all, what was your response? What was your reaction to what occurred on October 7th? And then we'll talk about the aftermath.
Yeah, there's an element of horror, just on a plainly human level. You know, I was having this discussion early on after this book came out. I was in London for the early part of the tour, and I was doing this interview with a reporter who was a very committed Zionist. And so, you know, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but whatever, this is the kind of book that prompts that, I get it. But one of the really interesting things about the conversation is that so many of the questions seemed, at least to me, to boil down to something like, oh, you don't want to see those people get slaughtered? Well, who do you want to see get slaughtered, kind of thing. And this notion that we were taking sides in our response to horrific human acts. Right after October 7th, this was less than a week after, I think, I was on the phone with a former colleague of mine, and I suspect a former friend. I suspect she'll never talk to me again. I suspect that she had family in Israel, and so, you know, I was asking her how she's doing, is everybody safe, so on and so forth. And she said something that stuck with me. She said, you know, it's really hard to be a liberal right now. And I've been thinking about that a lot because I think it was a very honest thing to say.
What do you think she meant by that?
I think particularly in this part of the world, there has long stood a kind of mode of liberalism which allowed for the kind of compartmentalization that I was talking about earlier, where one is able to say, I think apartheid is bad, but then silo off a particular instance of that apartheid that is actually good and necessary. Segregation, people being made to take different buses or carry different ID cards is bad, but then being able to silo off one instance where it's not. People being kept in an open-air prison for decades on end is bad, except in this one case. And I think because of where we live and because of our great distance from where this is actually happening, both physical distance but also narrative distance, we're able to generally do this, or a lot of human beings are able to do this. And now suddenly that was being imploded. And I think it caused a lot of people who previously subscribed to that mode of liberalism, caused them to have to reassess all of that. I think that's what was going on, but I genuinely don't know.
You know, it's clear in the book that you are insisting that history did not begin on October 7th, 2023, that there was a before, and that it's problematic to act as if this event on October 7th, 2023 can be divorced somehow from the many events that have taken place over the last century and more. You say in the book, the barbarians instigate and the civilized are forced to respond. The starting point of history can always be shifted such that one side is always instigating, the other always justified in response.
I don't think this just applies to Israel or Palestine, right? Right now, I live in a country where the very sort of load-bearing beams of historical account are being taken apart right before our eyes. I mean, the Trump administration is doing this in real time, and not in a subtle way. Would I be particularly surprised if the Smithsonian Museum of African American History is effectively shuttered? Not really. Control over narrative has never been a small element of control over human beings and control over everything. One of the difficulties of this is that I end up having this discussion in North America and almost nowhere else. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with this refusal to accept a narrative starting point that casts an entire population of human beings as a group of irredeemable savages who got up one morning and decided that history out of context completely would begin on this day with a massacre. When I talk about this, again, there is this kind of instinctual response that I'm on board with the slaughter of one group of human beings because I'm advocating against the slaughter of another. I don't know. It just feels like there's a hopelessly broken narrative in this part of the world especially that has as its starting point whatever the last atrocity committed by members of one group and then justifies everything in between that and the next atrocity. And I guarantee you another atrocity is coming. I've seen enough parents bury their kids to know that there must be an incredible rage there. And I know it's an unpleasant thing to think about, but I also know that history will reset itself once that happens.
There has been so much attention in the wake of October 7th, 2023, paid to the language used to describe what you call Israel's campaign of obliteration. We know that some 50,000 Palestinians have been killed by the forces of the Israeli Defense Force. We know that almost the entire population, some 2.3 million people, have been displaced. We know that hospitals have been attacked, ambulances have been attacked. We know that all the universities have either been damaged or destroyed. We know that libraries, we know that museums have been destroyed. We know that key water and sanitation facilities have been destroyed as well. The word that seems to cause so much controversy is genocide. I'm curious as to why you think there is such controversy when employing that term to describe the campaign that Israel has been conducting in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories.
Because I think it's a term that doesn't exist in a vacuum. The history of the term, dating back to the man who coined it, is full of examples of an incredible institutional reluctance to use it. And it's not because people are squeamish about the term. That's an individual thing. At an institutional level, it's because the term comes with obligations.
You have to do something about it.
You have to do something. Not just to counter it, but to prevent it. And so look, setting aside the fact that there is no doubt in my mind that if this were happening to any other more privileged group, if the same acts were being done, that it would be much easier to use that word. Setting all of that aside, I think what we're looking at here is not a new phenomenon. There is always an incredible reluctance at a state level to call a genocide because the moment you do, you have signed declarations and agreements that obligate you to do something about it. And that's why we're doing this at an overarching level. At an individual level, I've met so many human beings, and I've talked to so many human beings for whom this will never be a genocide. When the very last Palestinian is killed, it still won't be a genocide.
How come?
Because I think there's a narrative adherence that simply doesn't allow that to be the case. When we started this question, you talked about this idea of we know 50,000 people are dead. We don't know that. We've been given that number, and when we're given it, particularly in this part of the world, it's always something like, according to the Hamas-affiliated health ministry, or whatever needs to be tacked on to the end of that sentence to subtly imply that these people are lying.
Well, The Lancet, the British medical journal, says it's many times that number.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I titled the book what I did for a reason, right? Because at some point, human beings outside those who are stuck there and who are being slaughtered will have much, much greater access, and we will get an accounting. And if we're to acknowledge the sort of plain racism of it all, what I mean is that when white Western journalists show up and start giving their accounts of what's going on in Gaza, what happened in Gaza, there will be a different response.
How come?
Because I think Palestinians have long been considered in this part of the world not sufficiently allowed or able to tell their own stories. Some of the most vital journalism in the world right now is being done by Palestinian journalists who are risking their lives and in many cases being killed for their work. It's still a Palestinian person's name on that story. And whether anybody here wants to admit it or not, there's an immediate discount.
The Israeli government, though, will say, Omar El Akkad, you have been duped. You don't realize that many of these journalists, these so-called journalists, are terrorists or if not terrorist sympathizers. And when they are targeted and when they are taken out, good riddance.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I genuinely don't. There are things that appear regularly in Israeli media, and without much fanfare and without much controversy, that were they printed in any paper in this part of the world, would get the editor fired and would produce a deluge of complaints. And that discrepancy has always been fascinating to me. Maybe I'm being duped. God knows there's a part of me that hopes that this entire thing is a hoax, that I haven't actually been watching children starve to death and get sniped in the head. This idea that I'm engaged in this as part of some kind of either incredibly naive sort of useful idiocy, or that I'm secretly on board with a terroristic effort to wipe out a people, strikes me as the sort of argument that is so lazy in its conception that I feel somewhat offended that I have to take it in good faith. It wasn't that long ago that we were having these discussions where there was immense outrage at the mere suggestion that the Israeli military would target a hospital. How many hospitals in Gaza are still standing? Maybe I've been duped. Maybe I've been taken in. I suppose one way or another, once the full historical accounting of this moment has been completed, we're going to find out.
You note in your book the lack of outrage on the part of politicians, pundits, writers, ordinary people in places like Canada, in places like the United States, when it comes to the plight of the Palestinians, and yet a great deal of concern, a great deal of care for the conditions in which Ukrainians are living. How do you explain that discrepancy? And what does that discrepancy tell us?
I don't really like to split the world into these sort of neat binaries, right? I don't think that's how the world works. But generally speaking, I think you're either of the opinion that liberation is an intertwined thing, or that it exists in silos, in little compartments. And if you believe in those silos, then you're always susceptible to the argument that the bad thing is happening to those people over there and will remain within the context and the confines of those people over there. The same politicians that have said nothing about the targeting of hospitals in Gaza were completely and utterly outraged when Russia targeted a hospital in the Ukraine. The way you move through that kind of ideological positioning and that kind of worldview is that you have to believe in these little silos. You have to believe that what is otherwise a plainly non-controversial position to take, that the targeting of hospitals shouldn't be allowed in any context, is somehow coherent with the notion that in certain cases it's okay.
You're a writer, but you are also a journalist. You worked with the Globe and Mail for many years. I'm curious as to what you think the role journalism has played, particularly the role of Western journalists have played in the days, weeks, and months following October 7th, 2023.
It established some norms that got a lot of people
How
killed.
so?
That, when you're in a newsroom, there's sort of layers between the reporting of the story and the publishing of the story. As the story goes through those layers, you get to understand a lot about the enterprise you're engaged in. For the last year and a half, I've been watching these news reports that assume a lot of things about a population. And that's reflected in the language. It's reflected in things like people whose heads collide with bullets. One of the examples I have in the book is of a TV newscaster in the UK who's describing a scene in which a Palestinian girl was shot by Israeli troops at a checkpoint. And he says something like, a bullet found its way into a van and hit a 4-year-old young lady.
What's a 4-year-old young lady?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I know that it's something less worthy of your empathy than a 4-year-old girl. But as a statement of fact, I have no idea what that means. That statement is doing work. It's doing a lot of work in putting a great deal of distance between an event and the natural human reaction to that event.
In the book, you write, in articles about atrocities committed by groups or nations that are not Western allies, nobody ever perishes in a blast. Buildings don't collapse of their own volition. Civilian victims aren't ordered by their interviewers to performatively condemn groups with which they have no affiliation. The violence is named as its perpetrator.
Look, man, you don't have to go far away for this, right? A lot of my examples in the book are from, quote unquote, far away, from the other side of the planet. But like here, in the country I live in, how many times has a black motorist lost his life after a police-related encounter?
Or her life. I'm thinking about Sandra Bland.
Right. Again, it goes back to this idea of how susceptible somebody is to the notion that all of this stuff exists in silos. It's not over there, and it's not them. And I find myself, purely in a sort of Machiavellian way, always lured towards this argument of, this is coming for you one day. This is coming for you and me and whoever. But that's not the reason to oppose this, right? The reason to oppose this kind of language, particularly in the mode of media, is that it is the opposite of meaning making. It's the obliteration of meaning, and it is wrong in of itself. I have no idea if this is eventually going to be all motorists and not just black motorists. I have no idea if this is going to move from indigenous activists who get the hell beaten out of them because they're opposing a pipeline and starts to become anybody who falls out of line in any way. I don't know, and it doesn't matter. It is the opposite of what good reporting is. It is deliberately imposing a fog onto a situation where the journalist's job is to impose clarity.
As someone who is a graduate of the Globe and Mail newsroom, you know that there's the mainstream journalism notion idea that the journalist is someone who should not be an activist. You push back against that notion. You argue that journalism is at its core one of the most activist endeavors there is. You also write that journalists themselves cannot call for justice except when they can.
So every year, a group of the best journalists in Canada travel to Ottawa, and they go meet with the Governor General for a really beautiful, lavish ceremony for the Michener Prize, which I think, if you ask most journalists in Canada, will tell you is the highest honor in Canadian journalism. It is an explicit criteria of that award that it has to have caused societal change. And that is a big part of the reason why that reporting wins the awards it does. And it's exceptional reporting. It's good journalism. It's what journalists should be doing. What is an activist but somebody who is trying to change the world for the better, who's trying to cause societal change?
Your book made me think a lot about James Baldwin and his book, his seminal book, the classic book, Fire Next Time. And it also got me thinking about Martin Luther King and his letter from Birmingham jail, written in April 1963, where he talks about the white moderate. And I think we've been kind of speaking about the liberal throughout this conversation. And I'm just going to quote from that letter of King's. He said, "I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season." How might we apply what King is saying there to the way in which many have been responding to what's going on in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories?
With the obvious caveat that I am not worthy of being compared to either of these human beings or even existing in the same moral universe, I think a lot about this idea of what it means to be a centrist. Because like the model of journalism I just spoke about, I think it's very, very susceptible to bad faith manipulation. Particularly in the United States, the far right in this country has understood that the center is deeply movable. And this person who is deeply devoted to rising above it all by occupying the center space can be moved further to the right or further to a particular mode of extremism by virtue of wanting to remain in the center. And so when I think about the centrist, I understand that there is a great kind of moral lightness that comes with believing yourself to be in the middle of all things and having the high-minded middle ground opinion. And if it was just a matter of personal aesthetics, if it was just a matter of self-opinion, go for it. Delude yourself however you want. But the vacancy of this kind of opinion and this kind of position poses an existential threat to the kind of work we have to do to make sure that this species even survives, let alone deals with all of these injustices.
Towards the end of your book, you say, in reality, it doesn't much matter what or how vigorously I condemn. I am of an ethnicity and a religion and a place in the caste ordering of the Western world for which there exists no such thing as enough condemnation. What do you want this book of yours, one day everyone will have always been against this, to do? And what can it do?
I mean, the answer to the latter part of your question is maybe nothing. We talked about Baldwin earlier. He spoke much more eloquently than I ever could about this notion that when you're writing the work, you have to make yourself believe that it will change the world, even though you know deep down that probably it won't. That's a particular kind of delusion that I think every writer, to one extent or another, has to believe in. In terms of what I want it to do, I don't attach much import to that. What little evidence I have of what it's actually done, and of that evidence what has been most gratifying, is that I think it has created a very small pocket of space for people who otherwise felt like they were losing their minds, who felt like they were in a situation where they were watching the worst thing they'd seen in their lifetimes and being told that they were bad people if they opposed it. I've done 2 months' worth of events for this book, and the crowds have been orders of magnitude greater than anything I have drawn in my career. Just hundreds upon hundreds of people showing up. And I guarantee it has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with the quality of this book. I think it has everything to do with just needing a space to feel like you're not losing your mind.
In the penultimate page of your book, you say, alongside the ledger of atrocity, I keep another, the Palestinian doctor who would not abandon his patients even as the bombs closed in, the Icelandic writer who raised money to get the displaced out of Gaza, the American doctors and nurses who risked their lives to go treat the wounded in the middle of a killing field, the puppet maker who, injured and driven from his home, kept making dolls to entertain the children.
It seems like an absurd thing to say, but I do think of this as the most hopeful thing I've ever written. I keep coming back to this, right? And I've said this time and again, as much as I've become dejected about the institutional load-bearing beams of the Western world, political, academic, journalistic, you name it, I've been equally as inspired by what people are willing to do and what people are willing to risk, individually, in solidarity with one another, in community. I'm not a brave person. I sit here in my house and I write. I'm not doing the work. But every day I wake up and I leech courage from people who are doing the work. Right now, speaking out about this, not even in a particularly disruptive way, writing an op-ed is enough to get you snatched by agents of the state and thrown into an unmarked van. There's something so much better than this that is possible, and every day these folks are making it work. They're making it happen, and it's slow, and it's painstaking, and you risk everything doing it. But I do believe it's coming, and all the while, cowards like me are leeching courage from these folks, and I'm grateful to them for that, because without that, I have no idea how I get up and get out of bed every morning.
Omar El Akkad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.